sein, an dem Stream zu starten, und ich starte mal die Aufzeichnung. Herzlich willkommen zurück zur Ringvorlesung zur Klimakrise. Ich möchte mit ein paar Dingen vorab beginnen, und zwar ist der 3. Online-Test heute vorbei. Wahrscheinlich haben die meisten von euch ihn auch gemacht. Und die Ergebnisse könnt ihr jetzt nach der Vorlesung heute Abend bis morgen Abend dann einsehen. Danach könnt ihr dann nur noch eure Punktzahl einsehen. Genau, und zu dem, was jetzt gleich kommt, nochmal ein kurzer Hinweis zum Inhalt. Es geht gleich um Rassismus und Polizeigewalt. Also macht gegebenenfalls kurz den Ton aus, wenn euch das gerade zu viel ist. Ja, vielleicht haben es einige von euch schon gesehen auf dem Fridays for Future Deutschland Instagram-Kanal. Am Wochenende in Berlin haben 4 BIPOC-AktivistInnen rassistische Polizeigewalt erlebt. Und wir vom Ringvorlesungsteam solidarisieren uns natürlich mit denen. Ich möchte hier an dieser Stelle gerne einmal den Instagram-Post vorlesen vom Fridays for Future Deutschland-Kanal, und den Link dazu schicke ich auch gleich nochmal in den Chat. In der Nacht des 2. Juli haben 4 junge, schwarze, Indigene und People of Color AktivistInnen von Fridays for Future Germany Racial Profiling und brutale Polizeigewalt erlebt, als sie zum gemeinsamen Treffpunkt in Berlin-Kreuzberg, einem stark von der Polizei kontrollierten Viertel, zurückkehrten. Dabei wurden die FFF-AktivistInnen von etwa 20 bewaffneten PolizistInnen aus 4 großen Polizeibussen umzingelt. Die Polizei äußerte Gewaltandrohungen, ignorierte offensichtliche Panikattacken und verweigerte medizinische Versorgung. Sie nahm ihnen gewaltsam ihre Smartphones ab, nötigte sie zur Herausgabe ihrer Passwörter und ließ sie anschließend allein und getrennt voneinander in einer Stadt zurück, die die meisten von ihnen nicht kennen. Eine der AktivistInnen war in derselben Nacht gerade erst 18 Jahre alt geworden. Der Darkest-Skinned-Aktivist der Gruppe wurde zielgerichtet attackiert und mit Handschellen gefesselt, während seine vielfachen Hilferufe von der Polizei und PassantInnen ignoriert wurden. Er war allein und wurde bis zum Nachmittag des 3. Juli vermisst, nachdem er in dem orchestrierten Chaos verloren gegangen war. Als Fridays for Future Germany müssen wir anerkennen, dass wir keinerlei Infrastruktur, kein Unterstützungssystem oder Verhaltenskodex für AktivistInnen bieten, die rassistischer Gewalt ausgesetzt sind. FFF muss sofort damit beginnen, diesen Zustand zu beheben. Der Vorfall wirft ein Schlaglicht auf die rassistischen Strukturen unserer Organisation, die eine koloniale Kontinuität der täglichen Diskriminierung von BIPOC-Geflüchteten und Migrantinnen darstellen. Dieser gewalttätige Angriff auf den Straßen Berlins repräsentiert die Leitkultur Deutschlands, also Leid mit D, nicht Leid mit T, die wir in Halle, Hanau, Frankfurt, Celle und Dessau gesehen haben und die sich an den Grenzen der EU stetig reproduziert. In der Tat ist es die Konsequenz rassistischer, kapitalistischer Gewalt, die indigenes Land auf der ganzen Welt zerstört und die Vertreibung von BIPOC-Klimaflüchtenden erzwingt. Wir erkennen an, dass wir uns nicht wahrhaftig als Bewegung für Klimagerechtigkeit bezeichnen können, ohne diesen Rassismus innerhalb unserer Organisation zu reflektieren, zu dekonstruieren und aktiv zu bekämpfen. Es gibt keine Klimagerechtigkeit ohne soziale Gerechtigkeit. Touch one, touch all, Hashtag so viele Einzelfälle. Ja, das möchte ich mal hier so stehen lassen. And now I will switch to English to introduce our guest today, Janani Vivekananda. Janani is head of the program Climate Diplomacy and Security at Adelphi. Adelphi, for the ones who don't know, is a large think tank for climate, environment, and development. Janani holds a bachelor's degree in philosophy, politics, and economics, and a master's degree in violence, conflict, and development from the University of Oxford. Climate change, peace, and security have been in her focus for far over a decade now, and she works on understanding the complexities of climate, conflict, and natural resource-related risks from a local level, and on how to integrate this into policy work. She has researched and worked on the context of different geographic regions globally and is currently zooming in from Berlin. Very welcome, Janani. We're very happy to have you here.
Thank you so much, Cornelius, and I'm delighted to be here. Thanks to everyone for joining late into your evening when you could be in the sun with a beer, but really glad that you're here with me. So I think if we can just get started. Thank you for the introduction. And yes, thank you, Jolene, for sharing the slides. Wonderful. So I would like to speak to you about the implications of climate change on peace and security. Why is tackling climate change vital to peace? What are the connections? How does climate change interact with peace and conflict? So next slide, please. So in the next hour or so, I'll run through these 4 key areas. First of all, I'll share with you 5 key insights based on what we know from the best available research, the climate models, what's actually happening on the ground, what we know and can actually say about the ways in which climate change affects peace and security. I'll then zoom in a little bit, so it's not so conceptual, and look at how this is actually playing out on the ground in the Lake Chad region. I will then propel us forward and propose questions that we need to be asking, 5 questions that we need to be asking, so that we're better placed to address these risks in the future. What kind of questions we need to be asking now to be able to plan and prepare for these risks and crises to come, and then wrap up with what we can actually be doing, what can be done about these risks. Next slide, please. But to kick us off, we'll have a little video which I think gives a nice overview of the ways that these things interact. The video was put together by adelphi, by Team at Adelphi and the Economist Intelligence Unit. So you can just go ahead and play. Let me know if the link doesn't work, Janani.
One second.
Mm-hmm. Just need to do a bit of screen share switching. There we go. I don't have sound. So there you go. This video is available on YouTube. If anyone wants to watch it again, please do. Maybe the organizers can share the link after or in the chat.
Du musst durchhalten. Google Pixel lädt mit.
Getting some sound. And if anybody's interested in sharing it via social media, please do. I think it's if you're interested in sharing anything on this topic, it's quite a succinct way maybe to articulate the ways that these issues come together. So just as the slides are loaded up again, I'll get started. Next slide, thank you. So let's get going. I'd like to share now the five insights on how climate change already poses risks to peace and political stability And then I'll move on to the 5 questions that we should be asking to be better prepared for these risks ahead. I'll flag as well, I think it's already been mentioned in the chat, but please do post your questions as I go. Anything, there's no stupid questions, so ask anything, and then I'll make sure there's enough time at the end to have a discussion for me to answer your questions. Next slide, thank you. So the first point that I want to start with is that sometimes we think about these risks as in the future, but as I'm sure you all know all too well, the risks that climate change poses, but also the risks that climate change poses to peace and security are very real. They're very present. They are not something simply for the future. They are happening now, and they are compound. There's no simple, direct, linear causal link. They're complex. They're messy. They're compound. And we need to be better at understanding them, to understand this complexity, to be able to anticipate them, to be able to ensure our interventions, our climate change interventions, our development and humanitarian interventions and peace building interventions do no harm to climate resilience, adaptation and mitigation efforts. We need to better understand these interactions so that we can prevent them where possible, prevent the risks, and respond to them when we're too late. Next slide, please. So the first insight I'd like to share is that the impacts of climate change can affect competition and potentially create or increase the risk of conflict over natural resources, things like land and water, which are very directly linked to climate impact. So climate impacts such as drought or intense rainfall or temperature rise can alter access to and the availability of these natural resources such as food and water, which are highly sensitive to climate impacts. And this can fuel competition and create tensions, which can contribute to violence if, and this is a very big if natural resources and conflict management institutions are dysfunctional. So the point here is that it's not about a scarcity of resources. It's not that there's going to be too little and people will fight over the dwindling resources. It could indeed be that there's too much. For example, with increased temperatures, we see glacial melt, which is increasing water availability in glacial fed regions such as Central Asia and the Himalayas. But it's the change in the availability and the access to these resources. And if there's no effective natural resource management mechanisms or mechanisms to resolve conflict over these resources, if this access is inequitable, then this can create violence and tensions. So many of these resources, water being a very good example, are spread across boundaries, state boundaries or sub-state boundaries. But as such, they can create disputes over usage, for example, between up and downstream water users, and can easily become interstate. For example, trans-boundary tensions around big river basins such as the Mekong or the Ganges-Brahmaputra basin. And these are often triggered by infrastructure developments such as large dams, as you might have heard in Ethiopia, the Grand Renaissance Dam, or large dams in China, built by China on the Mekong, or in Central Asia, for example. So the important point is it's not about shortage of resources per se, although that is often a dominant narrative. It's not entirely evidence-based. It's about where changes to climate affect people's access to resources, which may have already been inequitable. And then climate change entrenches these structural inequities, the unfairness, maybe preferential access to a resource such as grazing land to one identity group over another. For example, one pastoralist tribe such as the Turkana in Kenya over the Pokot in Kenya. Or where there are no longer effective dispute resolution mechanisms to deal with resource conflicts without violence. Next slide, please. The second insight is that climate change can undermine livelihoods, and this can affect human mobility, and it can push people into illegal coping mechanisms. So adverse climate impacts that I outlined earlier, particularly given the reliance in many parts of the world on natural resource-based jobs, on agrarian livelihoods, can push people to move and change their livelihoods in search of other jobs, and this can often entail changes to their regular migratory patterns, and this could then put them in conflict with others, especially when people are moving from one place which is maybe facing climate stress to another place which is already facing resource stress. So in the Lake Chad region, which I'll go into in more detail later, as the islands in the lake became less livable, as the waters in the lake rose, the islands were very fertile, they were really great farming land. People moved from the islands, those that lived on the islands moved from the islands to the mainland on the kind of the coastal belts, and this put them into conflict and created increased competition, and especially given that because of the conflict, less of the land around the lake was accessible, and so fewer and fewer resources had to be shared by more and more people. So there was then an increase in conflict between incoming island dwellers and the host communities who had already settled around the lake. One concern that we often hear, often in the mainstream media, or when we hear politicians talking about this pathway, this link between climate change and people's mobility and livelihoods, is that there's a concern that Europe, particularly the Mediterranean region, will become a hotspot for climate-related migration. But actually, this isn't very grounded in evidence. We haven't seen the data to support this. In fact, at present, most of the migration that we do see is mainly internal. If it is linked to climate change, it's internal within countries, and it tends to be from urban centres, from rural areas to urban centres, or from rural areas to other rural areas. And it's not that climate change is, or migration is a negative issue on its own. Migration and mobility can be important coping strategies. People have always moved, maybe between harvest or between seasons. There's been kind of circular migratory patterns, and these are changing, but they are often important coping mechanisms which can be managed peacefully if there's effective governance mechanisms. But indeed, it can also contribute to instability and tensions in host communities and between hosts and incomers, and put additional pressure on receiving areas when there's inefficient governance structures and service provision already. But this is generally within countries, in rural, urban, rather than across state boundaries. Next slide, please. So here we can see the illustration of these of this pathway. And another point here is that climate change can also push people into illegal or negative coping strategies or livelihood strategies. So if a livelihood is made more vulnerable or less viable as a result of climate change, so agrarian livelihoods such as farming or pastoralism or fishing, which are very sensitive to changes in temperature, in air temperature and sea temperature, affecting fish stocks and crop yields, for example. This is pushing people into illegal livelihood strategies such as drug production, the production of opium, growing poppies in Afghanistan, or khat in Yemen, or production of charcoal in Somalia, which is very, very ironic because, of course, it's the deforestation which is making people more vulnerable to climate change. When rains come, of course, with the fewer trees there are, there's more flooding and mudslides, but deforesting to produce charcoal is a coping mechanism when people are unable to fish or farm. So you kind of get these vicious circles locking in. We also see more people looking at sex work or being forced into very negative coping strategies as a means to an income when the people move from rural areas to urban centres, and there's very limited livelihood opportunities available to them, or indeed falling into criminal networks because they are highly vulnerable when they move. Gender norms play an incredibly important role throughout all the pathways that I'm talking about today, but especially in this one. It's really important to think about who migrates and who stays. In some communities, it's the men who leave to work, and the women stay, and in others it will be the women who would leave perhaps to go and work in domestic labor. For example, this is the case in South Asia. Lots of women and girls will be leaving to work as domestic laborers in the Arab states. In Africa, it may be more that because of the role of masculinities, it's men that will go and the women are left behind, and you have then more female-headed households, bringing with it positives and negatives in terms of greater empowerment of women in decision-making, but also higher vulnerability and limited decision-making powers if they're locked out of customary governance mechanisms. So it's always important to understand, given any specific context, not just gender, but also the intersectional ways in which those are affected by these climate impacts. These impacts will affect different people in different ways. If you are male, female, young, old, of a different ethnic or religious group, or disabled or sexual orientation. So this is something that is really important in the analysis and ensuring that we have disaggregated data to understand these risks. Next slide, please. The third insight is that climate change impacts can contribute to extreme food price spikes and food insecurity. So it's not just about food scarcity. It's not simply that there'll be less food, but rather what links to violence is the spike in pricing. So yes, we might see crop yields diminished as a result of climate change, but the conflict link can be mitigated if there are safety nets and buffers in place. For example, state subsidies. But what we see, where we see the link to violence and instability, is where there are extreme food price shocks. And perhaps one of the most well-documented examples of this, or indeed any kind of climate-related violence, is linked to food insecurity, and it was highlighted by the food riots around the world between 2007 and 2008, and then again in 2011. And this was related to food prices. It wasn't directly because of this, but it was linked to this, where we had droughts happening simultaneously in Russia and in China, affecting wheat harvests in both of these huge wheat producing countries, which meant that global wheat prices, and then of course other food commodity prices were hit, leading to many people around the world being unable to afford food. What happened also is that many countries who are highly reliant on food imports, for example, Egypt and many of the countries affected by the Arab Spring, because they were no longer able to pay these higher prices for importing food, such as bread, they removed subsidies, bread subsidies in particular. And this, of course, meant that people were hit very quickly and very hard by rapidly increasing food prices. We are likely to be seeing this playing out again. We're already seeing food riots and protests in Iran linked to the current situation due to climate and the conflict in Russia, in the Ukraine, and this is also something that will be it affects all contexts, but those regions most dependent on agriculture and those dependent on food imports will be the most vulnerable. Next slide, thanks. And here you can see the illustrated pathway. So here you can see the impacts of climate change on agriculture will decrease harvest and increase prices, which contribute to more volatile food prices and food supply. And this is especially problematic in countries with weak governance and dependent on food imports, so much of the Middle East. And it can, of course, serve as a catalyst to protests and create political instability when there's already grievances towards governments, and this is then an additional strain. So in the MENA region, for example, more than 50% of its food is imported, and they will require increasing foreign exchange to meet growing demand for food imports, as if climate means that they're producing even less. And yes, we've already seen food prices triple in Iran at the same time as the government's removed food subsidies, which has already led to riots and death. So this is something that we're seeing playing out just another decade after the last time this hit at a global level. Next slide, please. So the fourth insight is that extreme weather events can challenge the effectiveness and the legitimacy of governance and governments. So basically the impacts of climate change challenges governments because the very basic purpose of a government is to safeguard the physical security of their people. And if they're unable to do this in the face of an extreme weather shock, such as a cyclone or a flood, if they don't rise to the challenge, it can undermine the legitimacy of this government. Now, if this happens in Germany and the government is seen to not have dealt with the floods very well, for example, maybe they don't do so well at the next election, but in a country with very poor governance and ineffectual government systems, and where this can be harnessed as this kind of lack of governance or poor governance can be harnessed by opposition parties and used to fuel grievances and tensions, and this can rapidly be kind of politicized and tip towards instability. So we witnessed this with the forest fires in Lebanon in 2019 and the recent water shortages in Iraq, Iran and Algeria just earlier this year, where we saw the government's failure to deal with these environmental stresses triggering violence and potentially can lead to kind of revolutionary movements and protests and movements towards regime change. It can also work the other way, I should say. So where a government is seen to have dealt with a natural disaster very effectively, that can be legitimizing, and it can restore people's faith in a government or bolster a social contract, or if it's a new entity, it can give them political credibility and legitimacy. So it wasn't necessarily climate change, it was actually just a non-climate related natural disaster, but an example would be after the tsunami in 2004, at the time, the Free Aceh movement, the GAM, was seen as a rebel movement by the international community, and they were not seen as a legitimate political actor, but they had de facto control over Aceh, and they were able to deliver tsunami relief incredibly efficiently and equitably, and this then gave them legitimacy in the eyes of the international community. They were taken off the US's international terror list, and it meant that they had a seat at the peace negotiations, and then were able to be part of the peace talks. So it can work the other way. It's just, unfortunately, we've got more examples of it, of the negative rather than the positive. But there is hope. Next slide, please. And then the fifth insight, and that's the final one on this part of the talk, is that it's not simply about the impacts of climate change, but actually how we deal with them. It's also about the unintended consequences of ill thought through policies, climate policies, or development, or security, or peace building policies. They can carry their own risks if they are not cognizant of the knock-on consequences on people's resilience or ability to adapt or ability to resolve conflicts peacefully. So an example would be very rapid pivots to low carbon strategies that we saw, for example, in 2008, when the EU decided to go for 30% biofuels by 2030. This meant that there was a very rapid shift in use of land from agriculture to producing biofuels for energy, and this at the same time as the climate impacts, the droughts in Russia and Ukraine and China meant that there was then a real squeeze on food production. So it led to a lot of food insecurity and the price hikes that I mentioned. So there are these knock-on consequences of these low carbon strategies, because they will create new winners and losers. They will create new stresses on or demands on already strained resources like water and land. Another example is hydropower can be cited as low carbon energy production, but of course dams are incredibly divisive and can lead to a lot of grievances at local level, but also between states. We almost saw Ethiopia going to war. And of course, not only can they have a negative impact on peace and security, these kind of environmental or climate policies, they can also be incredibly detrimental to climate change, resilience factors, and also be have a very negative impact on the environment in itself. And I'll also touch on some of these examples of climate insensitive peace and stabilization strategies in the examples I will share shortly from the Lake Chad region, where we see, and this is the same across the Sahel and Mali and many other countries in the Sahel, where you have military strategies such as scorched earth approaches by the military, where they're just going to raise farmland or small villages to the ground as a means of kind of flushing out armed groups and enemy fighters. This, of course, has a very long-term adverse impact on people's livelihoods, and this has then a very negative impact on farmers, very aggrieved farmers who have lost their livelihoods. You can't plant on scorched land for many years, and then we see this anger, these grievances being translated into a motivation to join armed groups. So we can touch on this later, but next slide, please. But now we will move to Lake Chad. So these 5 insights were very conceptual. I've tried to share some examples, but I think it's much easier to understand and see how these risks really play out by applying it to an actual context. And I would like to share with you some examples from the Lake Chad region. This is based on findings of a study that I was involved in called Shoring Up Stability, conducted a couple of years ago, where we did in-depth risk assessment across all 4 countries around the Lake Chad basin to look at how climate change affects current and future conflict dynamics. So we did brand new climate and hydrological analysis, looking at satellite data and the best available climate information. And then we did research on the ground. We had local research teams in each of the 4 countries in the communities around the lakes, and we conducted over 200 interviews with women, young people, old people, men, ex-combatants, current combatants, people with disabilities, etc., to get as comprehensive a picture as we could of the different risks and the ways they were affecting different people. Next slide, please. But to give you a break from my voice for a few minutes, we'll have another video. So I will just let the technical team get that on.
The world's most extensive humanitarian crisis since 1945 is currently playing out in the 4 countries that surround Lake Chad: Cameroon, Chad, Niger, and Nigeria. The emergency in the region affects some 17 million people. 7.2 million are dependent on food aid, and 2.4 million have been displaced. What are the root causes? How important is climate change? And what should be done to secure lasting peace?
The international community has recently, in fact, recognized that the humanitarian crisis in the Northeast is one of the worst disasters in human history. So honestly, children are dying for malnutrition. Up till today, Boko Haram is still abducting women and girls, and then forceful recruitment is happening. So it's just unfortunate, honestly.
Aujourd'hui, on sait que au niveau de la région du lac Tchad, la situation économique s'est complètement détériorée, puisque ces populations qui vivaient principalement de pêche, d'élevage et d'agriculture se sont vues aujourd'hui abandonner leurs terres et se retrouver dans des camps de déplacés.
Multiple pressures converge around Lake Chad, ranging from unemployment and poverty, to political marginalisation and gender-based violence, to climate change impacts such as droughts, desertification, and depleting resources. Lake Chad is critically important to the surrounding population, providing water to more than 68 million people. The population is constantly growing, but the availability and the predictability of the lake's waters have reduced dramatically.
Aujourd'hui, ça représente en quelque sorte un miracle, une sorte d'oasis au milieu de cette Afrique subsaharienne, mais ça ne veut pas dire que dans le contexte du changement climatique, ce milieu reste extrêmement fragile, puisque le changement climatique actuel est caractérisé par une très grande variabilité. Même si on voit depuis le début des années 90 une réaugmentation de sa superficie due à une intensification du cycle hydrologique, également des événements extrêmes de précipitations qui sont de plus en plus fréquents. Donc c'est pour cela que le lac Tchad ne va pas disparaître, en tous les cas pas tout de suite, comme il semblait que ce soit dit.
So it is a kind of perfect storm of climate fragility risks in that area.
These pressures combined contribute to increased conflict between fishers, herders, and pastoralists. Large-scale violence, Islamist insurgencies, and forced migration are dramatic results. Some people perceive climate change and climate variability as very significant factors contributing to the conflicts, but there are no simple answers.
The main cause for all this conflict that has later become this big insurgency is climate change. The drought that started in 24 years ago is what has affected majority of the populations in the Lake Chad Basin. So people whose livelihood depend on this water become vulnerable. So this is putting the pressure on people to move to where there is water.
Le changement climatique est un des facteurs. Le changement climatique n'est pas complètement le seul coupable dans la situation du bassin lac Tchad. Et maintenant, nous avons aussi un système scolaire complètement déstabilisé, un système de santé complètement écroulé. Effectivement, les structures de santé ne sont plus aujourd'hui fonctionnelles et les écoles ne le sont encore moins.
Donor nations in February 2017 pledged $672 million in emergency aid. But the actual help must be grounded in the reality of people's lives. That means that humanitarians and peace builders have to take into account the specific risks to and roles of women, girls, boys and men. They have to factor in structural, political exclusion and widespread corruption, and include current and future environmental problems.
So I just came back from a mission with the World Food Programme, and the purpose of that mission was basically to get a better insight of the complexity of the problems around the Lake Chad Basin. And it was quite interesting as we had the chance to visit many IDP camps and talking to many humanitarian organizations. A couple of the IDP camps that we visited, it is basically women that ended up there, because the small villages were destroyed, totally burned down, men were killed, women then had to escape with their children. But what I realized is that there is a dual development crisis, that they had to leave on the one hand as displaced people, but the kind of suffering is going to continue in these IDP camps.
Most of the areas around Lake Chad Basin have been desperately poor for the last decades. Authorities, governments have not looked after the people, have not looked after social systems. I think a lot needs to be invested in social security, social systems, education, gender training, if you so will, to get some kind of perspective of stability. But it needs a long breath and patience for the international community. Humanitarian organizations come in, they do their job, they help the people, they try to manage a crisis. But this should always be done in close consultation and in coordination with the government of the respective country. Otherwise, of course, there would be a crowding out effect.
It is imperative to include all stakeholders in the policy process. Adelphi therefore organised a meeting on Lake Chad with donors, climate scientists, and local practitioners who are engaged in civil society and speaking on behalf of women and youth.
What we've been able to do with some success, I think, is really get a 360-degree insight into some of the complex compound challenges, because they're not just environmental challenges. It's not just about the water table shrinking.
One part of the solution or approaches to climate change and fragility is always governance. So how are the governments, both the national governments and the provincial governments, working on this? Are they including local people in the solutions as they develop them? Are they working together? Are they cooperating?
To sustain peace in the Lake Chad region or all over Africa, and to deny space for recruitment to terrorism in the continent, you really have to empower, give young people opportunities. You have to deal with issues that are displacing them and affecting their livelihood, such as climate pressures. And you really have to ensure that that they're represented in the political processes.
How do we address it? At the level of the state, we have to reduce fragility. At the local level, dialogue between resource users, between different ethnic groups. We are trying to share the resources. We have the common pool resources equitably.
The security challenges are daunting. Diplomacy needs to consider the overall picture when planning or supporting interventions in the Lake Chad region.
When Sweden was the chair or the president of the Security Council in January, we actually brought together a meeting on the Lake Chad region for the first time. One of the results from that meeting was the council going on the trip in early March, and I joined that trip. It was a trip of PRs on the council, the 15 members, and we went to Cameroon, to Chad, to Niger and to Nigeria. The more immediate measure is to strengthen the capacity in the Secretariat, around the Secretary General, to assess climate-related risks, but also to suggest how those risks can be managed, and managed early on before conflict erupts as a matter of prevention.
After we have submitted the report New Climate for Peace to the G7 foreign ministers, they have agreed to set up a working group to think about what kind of action the G7 foreign ministers could take. And they agree on conducting a joint risk assessment on one region The Lake Chad came up as the most interesting example where the most political need is, and this is actually where our mission is now contributing to find out what we can do. What we would like to do over the next year is really to conduct that study based on field visits there, interviews, and help then the organizations plus the international community in order to develop perspectives and also mechanisms for intervention that could help the humanitarian organizations to move ahead from relief to recovery and resilient programs.
So there you go. Based on this study, we found that first of all, it's incredibly important. You can move to the next slide, thank you. It's incredibly important to know what the climate change implications are going to be. So use the available climate data. What we found is that there was a very strong narrative based on very old climate information from the 1970s, which was inaccurate, that the lake was shrinking. What we found when we looked now is that, contrary to popular belief, the lake is not shrinking. You can see here, there's one picture missing. We didn't quite have the image, clear enough image, but you can see that whilst from the 70s to the 80s, the lake did shrink. It's the kind of blue area. And the green is kind of vegetation growing up where the lake was. By 2013, the volume of the lake is increasing again from an all-time low in 2003. In 1987. So the lake is not shrinking, but that's not to say that the region is not vulnerable. It is highly vulnerable to climate change, but it's not as simple as a shrinking lake or drought, but rather it's the increasingly variable rainfall. And it's incredibly important to know what the climate impacts are, because if you get the symptoms wrong, then your diagnosis will be wrong, and then the solutions will be wrong. So it was very important for us to understand that it's about increasingly unpredictable and variable rainfall. People just didn't know when the rains were coming, how much rain would fall, and the implications of this was that, given that over 90% of people depend on the lake for their livelihoods, or rainfall for their livelihoods, these people were finding their livelihoods less and less predictable, and thus less and less viable. So based on this and the conflict and contextual analysis, we were able to identify a number of risks. Next slide, thanks. The first risk, and you heard some of these in the video. The first, sorry, you can skip this slide. It's maybe a little small for you to see on your screens. The first risk is that conflict and climate change together were undermining people's livelihoods. So the dynamics of this ongoing conflict, which had been going on for over a decade, were undermining people's ability to deal with the changes in the climate, namely increasingly variable climate change. So conflict meant that people couldn't travel or access parts of the lake, which were kind of Boko Haram country. So it meant that, previously, maybe if the rains were late, they might farm or fish if they didn't have access to the lake or that part of tranche of land. These coping strategies were not available to them. People's adaptive capacity was also being undermined by large-scale displacement of people as a result of the conflict, and also restrictions to people's movement by the military. So the military's crackdown of the insurgency involved things like closing roads, declaring huge areas of land no-go zones, because these were Boko Haram areas, and if you were found farming there or living there, you would be labeled a terrorist. So this really limited people's ability to cope. And this really weakened social cohesion, and social cohesion was also a really important way for people to be able to cope with climate variability historically. Next slide, thanks. We also found that climate and conflict was increasing competition over natural resources. So the large number of internally displaced people restricted access to restricted people's access to resources. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, there was less available land, and this led to competition over these natural resources. So it was a mixture not just of climate change, but also of conflict, which disrupted previous governance and restitution measures as well. So if there was a conflict, maybe there would be traditional mediation mechanisms where if a if a herder's livestock encroached on a farmer's land, they would settle it amicably. Perhaps the farmer would give some amount of milk as payment in kind, or if it was the other way around, maybe the farmer would give some of the crop yields. But because of the additional stress of conflict and the extraordinary strains of these climate shocks, these traditional restitution measures were either no longer viable, or they didn't exist any longer, because these mechanisms only worked based on trust when the communities knew each other. But with all the displacement, people didn't know each other, and there was just a lot. The social cohesion was weakened, so these trust-based systems were no longer able to diffuse conflicts without violence. Next slide, thanks. The third risk was that the ongoing challenge of recruitment by armed opposition groups. So as people's livelihoods became less viable, these agrarian livelihoods, which were becoming less and less predictable because of the uncertainty of rainfall, it made the offer of armed groups of an income, a stable income that wasn't dependent on the weather and status and a position in society, it became more attractive. Also, things like loans, these armed groups such as Boko Haram and Islamic State West Africa province were offering things that the government wasn't providing as people were struggling more and more in the face of these climate stresses. So things like loans to start a small business or a loan to get married. So in the context of stark social and economic inequality and very weak government and governance service provision, or in so many cases completely invisible state and increasingly vulnerable livelihoods, this lure of financial incentives, not the ideological, but rather just the financial incentives, meant that more people were joining and staying in armed opposition groups. So climate change was compounding this risk because it was undermining already fragile economies and livelihoods. I'm saying this because it wasn't that climate change was causing people to join armed groups, but rather it was compounding some of the drivers of this. And the next slide, please. And the fourth risk, which was really surprising to me and the team, was it wasn't simply the climate impacts, but it was some of the very heavy-handed military responses that people spoke about as really undermining their resilience and their ability to change. So whilst the national militaries in the regions to the region, their very militarized approach often undermine people's livelihoods directly or indirectly. So the slash and burn or scorched earth policies, or blocking roads, or closing markets, for example. They would close fish markets because they thought the proceeds would go to funding armed groups. They were seen to really lack sensitivity to people's livelihood security and their traditional historic climate coping strategies, and just the basic needs of local populations. And so this really undermined people's trust in the state and created a lot of anger and grievance. And people cited this with a real strength of passion. People said to us that they had no affinity to these armed groups. They in fact didn't like them at all, but they joined Boko Haram for vengeance against the state, for revenge, because they were so angry that the state security forces had burnt their land. Next slide, please. So it was just very ironic that the methods used by security providers to stabilize the context, to try and bring peace and safety and stability to these people was actually doing exactly the opposite, because it was climate blind and it was undermining their ability to earn a living and feed their families. And it was in fact pushing people into the arms of armed opposition groups. So in sum, we found that many of the programs in Lake Chad, there's a lot of humanitarian aid. You heard in the video, billions going in, a lot of military responses and stabilization initiatives. But when we looked at them, we found that none of them had taken sufficient account of climate risks. And indeed, many, particularly military responses, but also development and humanitarian responses, were actually undermining people's ability to cope with climate shocks, because they were not thinking about how the intervention was affecting people's ability to cope with this variability of rainfall. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go through this slide in detail, but we did identify a number of interventions, a number of ways in which these risks could be addressed. But one that I want to stress is the first one in this list, and it's about building social cohesion. And this might be surprising because it's nothing to do with climate change adaptation. It's nothing to do with directly to do with peace building. But one thing we found is that social cohesion within and between communities, so within ethnic or geographic communities, or between communities, different identity groups, or different genders, or different between youth and elders, for example. This was an incredibly important dimension of resilience. And this would be a very strong way of increasing people's resilience to cope with climate shocks, but also foster peace between communities, between host communities and IDPs and refugees, between former fighters and other communities, between farmers and pastoralists, and across different generations, for example. Maybe if you get the slide deck afterwards, you can take a look at the slide in more detail, so that it's not all negative and you can see some of the positive green shoots as well. I'll now move on to the looking forward part. So given that these risks are already upon us and the pace of change means that the past is no longer a good enough guide to the future, we've been looking forward. So we teamed up with, at Adelphi, we teamed up with a group of super forecasters, a team called Good Judgment, who do some incredible super forecasting or forecasting work. They're the world's leading super forecasters. And we used foresight and super forecasting methods to identify the key questions that we should be asking now to avert some of the kind of impacts which can become the crises of the future. So within these insights, these 5 insights in mind, what questions should we then be asking to help us with better foresight, so we're not blindsided by some of the crises to come? So we asked the super forecasters, and we helped together to identify the questions and the answers to the most critical questions for the next decade. Now the questions shone a spotlight on areas that we think require consistent attention from policymakers over the next decade. And they were published in a report last month for the G7 summit called 7 Questions for the G7. I think I could share all the links, or they should be in the slide deck as well. Next slide, please. So the first question is, where will climate change fuel instability across fragile settings around the world? Next slide, thanks. The super forecasters, the experts, warned that climate change impacts could increase the risk of conflict in fragile communities, but this is of course incredibly hard to measure. So we use a displacement as a proxy for fragility. So the super forecasting metric, or the forecasting metric, was the set question: which of the following regions or countries will World Bank data show to have had the highest percentage of displacement between 2022 and 2031? And you can see that the regions in blue are the 5 that were selected, and you can see the numbers. So the super forecasters said that climate change could accelerate primary drivers of displacement, but climate change wouldn't be a driver in and of itself, but rather it will interact with other key drivers of displacement, such as a history of armed conflict or weak governance. And the countries that were seen as most vulnerable were all in Africa: Central African Republic, the DRC, and Ethiopia. Next question, thanks. The second question was how much and where will food prices fuel instability across fragile settings around the world? Next slide, thanks. And from the earlier insight, we could see that food insecurity is a key vector linking climate change impact to instability. So we therefore measure future volatility in global food markets to get an indication of the risk of instability. The question that we used was, what will be the FAO's cereal price index in real terms for December 2031? So the super forecasters thought that an increasing frequency of extreme weather events, plus, so linked to climate change, but alongside trade restrictions, which is a governance response, could lead to food price spikes, but they only saw a 10% probability of the FAO cereal price index exceeding 150 in real terms by 2031. But they did see at least one spike in the next decade. And interestingly, we did this in January, and by March, we saw the FAO cereal index price exceed 170 points in the wake of the Ukraine crisis. So it just shows that none of these things should take us by surprise. If we're asking the right questions, we should be able to preempt and be better prepared for this. So we've already met the forecast, but perhaps we underpredicted on this one. The third question is that as climate change impacts intensify, where and to what extent will megacities in low and middle income countries become more fragile? So we gave the super forecasters a short list. I don't know if you can see, but I can barely see in my slides. But we had Bangalore, India, Cairo, Egypt, Calcutta, a list of megacities in very climate vulnerable, but also fragile, poorly governed contexts. And the super forecasters found that there's a high overall likeliness that megacities in low and middle income countries would be more fragile in 2031 than in 2015, in fragile contexts where there is weak governance, where governance is broken down, where the basic services are scarce. And this will mean that people are more vulnerable to climate hazards and then potentially more exposed to violence. The fourth question is, where will stresses on water governance increase security risks? Importantly, it's not stresses on water and amount of water, but rather on the governance of water, because this is what determines whether there'll be conflict. So far, we have not seen conflict over water. But the next slide, thanks. The super forecasters found that climate change will place increased stress on water resources with potential to increase competition over scarce water resources linked to local or intrastate conflict. But they found that countries are unlikely to use water availability as a direct justification of conflict. They saw a 59% probability that deadly interstate conflict explicitly linked to water will not occur. So over 50% likelihood that there will be no water-based conflict in the next decade. But they did find that fragile regions with weak governance, poor infrastructure, and fragile institutions are more likely to experience water-related conflicts. Next slide, thanks. And the fifth final question was around the kind of decarbonizing our energy production. So where will oil-producing countries remain stable in a decarbonizing world? Because of course, as we move to a green economy, as we pursue all these very noble efforts to transition from fossil fuels, what will happen to major oil-producing countries where the economies of Venezuela or Nigeria or the Gulf states will be crippled? And governance regimes may not be able to cope with. They'll be the losers of the green transition, shall we say? So we gave the super forecast is a list of fragile oil producing countries: Algeria, Iran, Iraq, Libya, Nigeria, Russia, Saudi Arabia, and Venezuela. So we found, of course, that decarbonization of global energy systems could lead and will lead to the value of fossil fuel assets to decline, posing significant risks to countries reliant on oil exports. And the super forecasters saw a high likelihood that at least one of these countries would undergo an extra constitutional change of government, with Libya and Iraq considered most at risk. However, decarbonization is not expected to be the primary driver of instability. It's rather likely to be existing factors like pre-existing instability, corruption, inequality, or weak governance. So there are your 5 insights, your 5 questions, a little dive into the Lake Chad. And next slide, thanks. So just in terms of what we can do about this, oh, sorry, this is the report. You can look it up if you're interested. It's quite a fun one. Oh, sorry, I think I've missed a slide. Not to worry, I can just talk you through it. What can we do about these risks to avert future crises? No, the slide's gone. not to worry, I don't know what's happened to it. The point is, these are not, they're not set in stone, whilst the impacts of climate change are somewhat locked into the system for the next decade. Even if we close the taps on fossil fuels today, the impacts are, of what we've already done are in the atmosphere. So we will be feeling those for the next decade, and they will be playing out in fragile states in the next decade. So there's not so much that we can do on the mitigation side, apart from just continue to mitigate, but there's a lot that can be done to ensure that our responses to climate change adaptation, which is the most relevant thing in most fragile contexts, because their carbon footprints are often marginal, but also around peace building and just straight development and humanitarian responses, need to be aware of these climate change implications, of people's capacities to cope with climate change, what dimensions of resilience they have, and not inadvertently do harm to these things. So these responses need to be climate and conflict sensitive. There's a lot that can be done. The analysis needs to be context specific and local as possible, and done by local communities and locally owned. Otherwise, we have these very macro level pictures that just don't tell us, give us the right diagnosis, because it can easily misdiagnose the problem, as I set out in the Lake Chad example. I will leave it there. I hope that there was some content there that was new or of interest. The last few slides had a number of additional resources for those that are interested. Maybe if Janani, if you could just go back to slide 35. Yep, so one more, go back one more. So there we go, there's a number of reports. The orange one in the top right corner is the Lake Chad study. If anyone wants to know more about this, the insights that I shared is from the report called 10 Insights. And I hope you might be interested to peruse. Next slide, thanks. There's also lots of resources on these websites. Next slide, thanks. There's also very specific, if you're interested in a particular country, we produce, we are the Secretariat for a Climate Security Expert Network, a global network of climate and security, local climate security experts, and we produce these analyses. If you're interested in a particular region, you can check out the website and see if it's covered. And also, just in case anyone is interested, there will be the Berlin Climate Security Conference later in October. And some of it will be streamed online. So if you just keep an eye on the adelphi web space or follow me on Twitter, then you can get more information about that. I'll leave it there and look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Janani. And I believe there's a lot of new information for all of us. We probably just also need some time to take it in. But some questions came in, and I'll just start off with one. So a person wrote, the climate crisis is a global problem and international cooperation is needed to stop global warming. What contribution can we expect or should we expect from the European Union? Also maybe talking about reparations, maybe in the context of colonial continuities.
Thank you for the question. It's a very hot political topic at the moment in the lead up to the COP in Egypt. There's a lot of conversation about loss and damage in particular, which is, I guess, the closest we get to reparation and compensation within the climate negotiations. Certainly, there's a lot written on this. My area is less on climate policy, more on climate peace and security. So I don't know that I can speak on behalf of what the European Union should be doing. I can say that I think they've got about 35 billion earmarked for climate and investing in climate change in fragile states, and I would hope that they do this in the right way, so investing it in a way that reaches the most affected communities, rather than just putting it into World Bank trust funds or into kind of big international processes. So that is the hope. The conversation on loss and damage and reparations will be a very interesting one to follow in this year's COP, particularly because it's hosted by an African state. So I think that will be a very interesting conversation and debate to follow.
Thank you. And another question that came up is, and I think you touched on it in the end a little bit, but what role do corrupt governments actually play? So I'm thinking about maybe oil extraction in the Niger Delta or Nigeria as a whole, or probably you have even more different examples, but that was a question that came up.
That's a great question, and it's a real challenge for the international community, for donors, because the most vulnerable, those most vulnerable to climate change are those in countries where the governments are not able to provide basic services. And in most cases, I don't want to say all cases, in most cases, it's because of corruption, ineffectual governance, inequitable governance. So then what do you do? Do you not put climate aid or give support to these fragile countries? If you look at where climate financing is going, the least goes to fragile countries and the most will go to the more stable ones. Of course, you need to have a very stable country to be able to even be able to get through all the hoops of the climate financing mechanisms. It's incredibly complex. I think it took a very stable country like Ghana about 12 years to kind of get a national adaptation plan through the right hoops to be able to then submit it to the Green Climate Fund, for example. One thing that I personally would be pushing for, and I know a lot in my this space would be pushing for, is that donors need to be less risk averse. They need to accept that those most vulnerable are vulnerable to the double risks of conflict and climate change. So you can't just simply think about a return on investment. And of course, an investment in a fragile state is a very dodgy investment. So, of course, from a financial perspective, it makes less sense to invest in fragile states. But this is where they need to be investing. They haven't yet squared the circle of how to deal with working in these fragile countries without bypassing the states. But the UN in this case is a useful partner because, of course, the UN is made up of member states, including these fragile, these shall we say, corrupt governments. So that's often a way to be able to engage. It's not perfect, but yeah, if you look at the numbers, 70% of the most vulnerable to climate change are in fragile states, but it's a margin, less than 10% of climate aid goes to fragile states with fragile governments.
Thank you. You've also talked about migration and mobility as coping mechanisms. How, and I mean, I don't know how long you've lived in Berlin, but how would you evaluate the discussion on climate migration in Germany, or the discourse maybe, also with security-related aspects?
I think it's not just in Germany. I think it's across Europe. I would evaluate it as being insufficiently grounded in evidence. It tends to be at a very high political level, because when you talk to those actually working on this topic, there's just, this is not what the evidence shows. It is rural-urban migration, it's internal migration, and the conflict risks are in small second cities. This is where you need to be investing, you need to be providing water access and governance support and livelihood support in, not even in the big cities, because they might have a bit more infrastructure, but in the smaller cities, because this is also where people are moving to. But of course, the political focus is on, migrants crossing the Mediterranean and coming into Europe. It's been a bit of a red herring. It's not where the discussion is, but there's a very interesting initiative called the Africa Climate Mobility Initiative, which is it's funded by Germany and the EU and the World Bank. And this is really building up a much more nuanced picture of what the situation is, which I hope will inform the policy narrative, so it doesn't get hijacked by this very populist narrative, which is kind of, let's build a wall to stop all the climate migrants coming. It's also important to note that there's a lot of difficulty around the concept of climate migrant, because there's never a single cause for people to migrate or move. It's always very, very compound. And this concept of climate refugee or climate migrant is challenging, because it's there will be multiple reasons. So climate refugee has, of course, legal implications. So it's best to sidestep this, because what you then get is a blockade from those that don't want to deal with refugees. And then climate migrants is best to avoid, because it's not monocausal.
Yes, or at least put it aside in think tank work.
Yes. I
mean, from an activist perspective, I still think it's quite important to highlight this. Is the climate crisis also officially classified as a factor in increased risk of war? Was a question that came up.
I guess this was the whole backbone of my input. I think it's certainly a contributory factor. The impacts of climate change are a phenomenon now. It was spoken about as a threat multiplier, something that compounds risks of conflict. I think we can also see that they create new conflict dynamics in and of themselves. It's not possible to say it's causing wars. We've got no evidence of this, but no conflict has ever had a single cause. But it's certainly an incredibly important part of the context that we need to understand in terms of the drivers, the actors, and then of course the ways that we respond to conflict and building peace.
Another question that I came up is, what can we do, or what needs to happen to raise awareness on the link of between peace and climate justice? So we as individual listeners in this case, I think was meant.
Oh, peace and climate justice. That's a great question. There can be no peace that's sustainable if there is no climate justice, because it is injustice and inequality. The climate injustice is no different to you can remove climate because it's the same injustice that will be underlying any conflict. It will be inequity, it will be lack of political voice, marginalization, lack of access to natural resources. So yes, you can't have peace, you can't have sustainable peace without climate justice. So what can you do? I'm sorry.
You want to answer the door quickly? Or?
My door?
Yes, of course.
Well, I'll be back in 1 second.
No worries.
Okay, it's the end of my childcare, I'm afraid. So maybe I need to wrap up quite soon. But yes, you could. I think it's important to share this narrative because it's not. Sometimes people feel that the narrative around climate security is kind of securitizing the discussion and moving it away from the core theme, which is about climate justice and climate action. But actually, it is incredibly important to ensure that we understand how climate change affects peace and the prospects of peace. Without peace, we cannot not have climate action, because if there is an ongoing conflict, no country is going to be able to think about adaptation or mitigation. And no climate aid is going to these countries affected by conflict, because you can't adapt in the face of conflict. You can't be investing in resilience building. So yeah, they go together. Share the video, and yeah, I think the Economist video is a really nice way that this link, the links, the mutually reinforcing links, because are set out. Because on the one hand, the drivers are the same. So climate change can compound conflict can compound climate. But the flip side is also true. So building peace will build climate resilience, and building climate resilience will build peace if it's done in the right way. So that's the positive side.
Thank you. And I think these daily conversations about it are very crucial and important, as you've already stated. And I mean, in the media, there has been a lot of talk about the role of fossil fuels, and example, the war of Russia on the Ukraine. Is there time for one last question, or would you like to wrap up?
Maybe one last question, yeah.
Okay, one last question. It might be a little bit personal, but do you still have hope that something will really change before the global north is also directly and strongly affected by the consequences of the climate crisis?
Do I have hope that something will change?
Before the global north is directly affected?
In
by
what?
Extreme weather events, for example.
Well, the global north is directly affected. I think the difference everywhere is affected. I think the difference is where there's capacity to cope and have early warning, have military come in with sandbags, have insurance, so that when your house floods, you can buy new furniture. We're all affected. It's just that I think from my side, the mitigation part has to happen, but the real determinant is governance, because that is what determines whether people can adapt or not. And that's where we are now. In the next decade, it's about adaptation. Of course, we need to be pushing for mitigation, but from a peace and security perspective, it's about ensuring adaptation, and that's about governance. So I do feel that things can change, but I think it's really important to bring the peace perspective into climate discussions. I think it's really important that it's at the COP this year. It wasn't sufficiently at the COP last year for political reasons, and it hasn't in the past because it's not one of the climate negotiation tracks, because it's seen as something separate. But I hope that what I've set out today shows that it's very, very much part of climate justice.
Thank you so much, Janani. Thank you for your time.
No, thank you. Thanks for the invitation. It's been a real pleasure. And if anyone's interested in or has any further questions, please do be in touch.
Okay. Thank you so much. Also, thank you for everyone who is listening. And Janani, do you have time for a little after talk? Probably not right now. So we're just
not now, but maybe we can just pick up on Friday or later in the week.
No worries. We'll just send you an email with all the other information.
Okay, yes. Wonderful. All right. Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for your attention. Have a good evening. Bye.
Bye.